things I do for YouTube, man. Hello everyone, welcome to Boss Coders. I'm Boss, and my goal is to equip everyone with the technical tools necessary to become the boss of their own lives. Today, as you can see from the title of the video, we're going to talk about something very close and dear to my heart: software design, or software development and application design, right? So today is going to be incredibly informal. I just want to warn you from the get-go. That does not mean you're not going to learn a lot, right? So let's get started. Apologies, technical difficulties. Here we go, right? Today's digital era. Everyone seems to have a great application idea, but turning that application idea into a functioning application, see, this is where the magic happens, that separates. Over the course of the next 2 videos, I'll be breaking down the complex process of application design into some digestible steps. I think in this one I'll do maybe get to 5 or 6, but we'll see. So, first step, right? Requirements gathering. I'm sure you've heard of it. You're not new to this game. I'm definitely not. So this is the first step we think about before even coding. It's essential to understand why and who the application is actually for. So one of the first steps is we need to get the client's needs. With this one, you can start with the basics. What does the client want? Why do they want it? You have to get a deep dive to understand their vision fully. And once you've understood the vision, you can then move on to doing things like functional and non-functional requirements. So this will be primary actions, processes, features that the software must execute. So actually that's functional anyway. Non-functional pertains to how a system performs its functions rather than the actual functions themselves. So to give some examples, a functional requirement might be users should be able to transfer money between accounts. Non-functional requirement would be the app should load this data, or the app should load user account details in 2 seconds. Probably under 2 seconds. That'd be a trash app. But yeah, so you can see the differences between functional and non-functional. And non-functional tends to be performance or security, usability related. So both of those are pretty necessary in the requirements gathering stage, right? Next, you need to, or not even next, maybe even before, it would be good to get this down to a T, but identifying stakeholders, key stakeholders. Some of the common ones you might see in projects would be the end user, of course. That's the key stakeholder. You have project managers, you have investors, QA testers, legal and compliance teams, things of that nature. So once you've done that, you can design user stories. This is kind of an agile methodology. If you guys have, I'm sure some of you have heard of agile, and this is where you might write something like, as a user, I want to be able to see my account details on this page and see all these 3 critical account details, right? And it's kind of like bite-sized descriptions of features from the end user's viewpoint. Some people like to embellish these, but I think keeping it simple is the best. And previously in my freelance projects, some things that I messed up were not getting the functional and non-functional requirements down to a T, and not actually going back to the client throughout the project and actually checking with them. So like, this is definitely what you wanted, because I'll be honest, clients' requirements and stuff and needs will change throughout and they'll pivot constantly. So it's better for you, and even if you're not working for a client, it's best for you to always come back to this stage and make sure, even if it's a personal project, that you know what you want and you know what your end goal is and you know what the requirements are, so that when you finally get to that end goal, you understand, okay, I've reached what I set out to do, right? So next step, define the scope. Man, this one can really mess you up if you don't do it right. So first step really would be, you need to think, after you've gotten all the client's needs, all the requirements, it's good to figure out the application boundaries. This is kind of setting the stage for your application. What areas will it cover? What functionalities does it include and exclude? Once you've gotten that, you can kind of think about doing your first iteration. This is pretty much known as the MVP, minimal viable product, I think. Don't fact check me on that. But yeah, this is your app in the most basic of forms. You're keeping everything that's functional and like the main meaty chunk of the app. All the frills and all of that you leave for later, and that you leave for what we call product increments. And there's other names for this, but this is basically just a way to describe progressively enhancing and expanding your application. You'll usually have like PI1s, PI2s, each product increment building upon the last, adding new features, refining existing ones based on user feedback and evolving requirements. So especially if you're doing a solo project, often when I was younger, I would tend to not do this part at all, and I wouldn't think about what the initial MVP was, and I'd just go out trying to dive straight in and building the biggest app I could and the full application all in one. And you tend to, doing it that way, you tend to, one, you get overloaded because you're not tackling the hardest problems first, and two, what you tend to find is that you could have done way less work and got the key functionality out, so it's a waste of time as well. So yeah, define the scope, second step. Third step, data modeling. Now this is actually when we're getting into the software design portion of it, right? So typically this is looking at how you're going to manage and store the data, how the data is going to move between different pieces of your architecture. So first step I usually go is figuring out the types of data I'm going to store. So what we doing here? We're doing user profiles, we're doing product listings, transactional data. And then one of the next steps I like to do is, now this is personal to me, but I like to draft the API endpoints. So usually before diving deep into all this data relationships and all of this nonsense, I find it's quite helpful to draft some basic REST API endpoints. So this will gives you clarity into what the primary actions and integrations and interactions the application will support. So let's say you're building, e-commerce app. You're building an e-commerce app, and then you might have endpoints like a get endpoint for products. You might have a post endpoint for adding new products, or a post endpoint for orders, and then you might have a post endpoint for users, and then with an ID on the end. You get the idea, right? So once you design these, it can really help guide the data modeling process down the line. Just make sure you just have to make sure at this stage that I'd keep it very high level, and I wouldn't go all the way into, like, let's say, writing every single endpoint for this data. So yeah, keep it very high level. Once you've got a rough idea, you can move into some relationship diagrams between data pieces and seeing how they interact. It doesn't have to be specifically, there's a spelling mistake there. I meant entity relationship, not endpoint relationship. Don't watch that. But yeah, you can, this is basically like a family tree of the data. How many, let's say you want to know, let's say for example, you want to know what links to what. Is there many-to-one relationship? All of this stuff, we've covered this before. Well, I've not covered it, but in university, I'm sure, or in your courses, you must have covered it. So that's the third step, right? Fourth step, we're looking at application flow and wireframing. Now, personally, as a design-focused coder myself, I love this stage, right? This is where we're looking into what the user actually wants and how the user is going to utilize your app. And I like to make my apps look very clean and fresh, as you already know. So one of the first steps we'll do is, or that I like to do, is do some flowcharts. We're looking at how the user would flow through the app. Like, what's the logon process? What's the registration process? If we're looking at the e-commerce app, what's the process of them adding, either if they're a supplier, adding all of their products, or if they're someone who's buying stuff, how does it look like to add it to the basket? You have to really go through step by step on here, and missing steps out can really hurt you down the line. So I'll make sure to take your time on this, and then as part of this, you can actually integrate the wireframes into the flowchart or into the application flow. And quick note on this actually. So steps 3 and 4, data modeling and application flow and wireframing. I would say personally they can be switched around for different purposes. For applications where the user experience is paramount, I would say it makes sense to start with wireframing and application flow. And that doesn't have to be very detailed in depth, but definitely I'd say that in that scenario where you're really focusing on the user-centric app, it basically puts the user's needs front and center from the get-go. But then if you're looking at something that's more heavily data driven, or where the data structure is very complex, we're talking about let's say you're working on something like Google Maps, and where you're looking for restaurants nearby, like the data that's going on there, I mean, I understand it, but you know what it is. A lot, like the data that's going on there is very complex. You're going to use all sorts of indexes in your actual database. So starting off with the actual wireframes, which would be very simple. There's no point to that, right? So in many cases, hybrid approaches work best. Maybe you begin with a high level application flow. You're not spending too much time on it, and then you're going to dive right into the data modeling to ensure the backend can support the journey. And then later on, you come back and you refine those wireframes and all of that stuff, right? So cool. That's step 4. Maybe we'll probably do this as the last step for today. Step 5, we're talking about choosing the right tech stack. So this step's pretty easy, to be honest. Honestly, because we've already done the requirements selection, we've already requirements gathering, sorry. Once we've got that, now we can basically look what are the non-functional needs of our app. So what's the performance needs? Like if we need a fast real-time app, then it's going to be very different tech stack to I know e-commerce platform. Maybe in the fast one you might be using some low level, them ones, C. Maybe the fast type of languages. When an e-commerce platform, it might be a whole different thing. So I'd say look at your non-functional requirements. This will be a big indicator of the right tech stack. And also, if you are working on a team, then go with what your team knows best, right? You don't want to be that guy that just chooses one random ass language and now everyone's struggling. Like, you could have just chose Python, man. So go with what your team knows best. Don't have to use a fancy new language if no one knows how to speak it. And if you're going solo, definitely choose the thing that has like a lot of users, so it'll have great documentation and help. 2, what you know the best again. So similar kind of thing to team proficiency. It's like you have to choose the right ingredients for a gourmet meal, right? So in conclusion, let's go through those again. We've got 1, requirements gathering, key stage, probably the most critical on this list. 2, defining the scope. 3, we got data modeling. 4, application flow and wireframing. 5, choosing the right tech stack, right? This is, I'd say, the first 5 steps I usually go through. I've got a pretty rigid approach at this point, but requirements gathering happens all the way throughout, and you can go back to each of these stages. But I found that following this kind of pattern really helps in fleshing out. Like, let's say you've been given a huge application as a vision from a client, and you just don't know where to start. You follow these 5 steps, you'll be in pretty good stead to go into the next meatier coding steps and all of that good stuff, testing, all of that. So the journey is long, but it's paved with some exciting challenges. Stay tuned for the second part, where we delve deep into the intricacies of the application architecture and beyond. And I might recommend some good books, because I didn't just know all this from when I was young. I still am young, but there's some good books that definitely helped me pick up some knowledge around the way, and obviously gain experience through actually working in an established firm. But yeah, until then, keep those creative gears turning, churn out some projects, and I'll see you next time.